Hello, I'm Maria from the Richardson's Homeschool Live. Sorry I'm a day late, normally I come on Tuesdays, but today's Wednesday. But due to unforeseen circumstances, I never got round to coming on yesterday. So I'm going to do something a bit different today. I think I told you about it last week. Sian does genealogy. I've been telling you about her genealogy, and I'd showed you the book that she was doing with the genealogy. And I thought what I'd do, I'll tell you some interesting things on the family tree. What I'm going to do today is tell you about a case of a lady who's on my tree named Rose Harsant. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of her. It is quite a famous story. It's been on television and it's in books. But I'm going to tell you all about Rose Harsant. It might be a bit long-winded, so you'll have to bear with me, but if you like a bit of a murder mystery, you might like to listen. The reason I think that it is good, before I do begin the story, the reason why I think it's good, like for homeschooling, doing these things, because I mean, I know with doing family trees, you're learning history, you're learning about the time periods people lived in, the reigns they were under, and everything like that. When you come across things such as I have, well, I've known about this for years, it's not something I've recently come across, but when you do have these things on your family tree or you discover things, you delve into other parts of studying, like psychology. Now, we have been doing a lot of psychology while studying Rose Harsant. You can't help it. So it is good for that. So genealogy is not just an interest or a hobby people have. If you're doing homeschooling and you're doing history and things like that, I mean, even geography, the places where people lived and the jobs they did, you know, it covers everything. It's really good for a topic for home education. So this is what we've been doing. So I'm going to tell it you. It's quite a long story. I might be with you for a while. I'm going to read it from my notes. And the notes are in a book like this, and believe you me, there's a few pages full. But at the end of it, be interesting to see what you think. So without further ado, I'll start because we're going to be here a while. So excuse me for not looking at you because I'm going to be looking down and reading to you. So Rose Annie Harsant was born on the 17th of December 1879 at Peasenhall in Suffolk, which is not far from the coastline, not a million miles away from Great Yarmouth. So it's sort of that end of the world, towards Ipswich, that end of the world. She died tragically on the 1st of June, sorry, not the 18th. Don't know where I got that from. So she was born on the 17th of December 1879 at Peasenhall, Suffolk, and she died tragically on the 1st of June 1902. Now, Rose is my fourth cousin, 4 times removed, and I've known about this story for a long time because I've been involved with a genealogist who is in my family tree, and she gave me a lot of information, and she's spoken to people involved with this story. So I've known about it for many years. I just thought it might be interesting. So, Rose worked as a servant for a Mr. and Mrs. Crisp, who were an elderly couple, and she lived in the servants' quarters at their home in Providence House, Peasenhall. Let's go back 120 years to the evening of Saturday, the 31st of May, 1902. Just after 10 p.m. in the village of Peasenhall, a violent thunderstorm erupted and it continued through to the early hours of the following morning. On the night that the storm began, handfuls of villagers stood in their doorways to watch the storm and doubtless passed the time in idle gossip with some of their neighbours. One of the people who came to the door to watch was a 35-year-old man by the name of William Gardiner. He was described as being handsome with black hair and he sported a beard and moustache. He was a well-liked, hard-working man who had risen to the position of foreman in the carpentry department of the Peasenhall drill works. He was also a respected member of the Primitive Methodist Church. Earlier that evening, William Gardiner had driven John Rickard's, who was the secretary where he worked, over to Kelsale in the firm's horse and trap. It was roughly 9 p.m. by the time he got back, and it took him another half hour by the time he'd stabled the horse at the drill works. When he got home, he put on his slippers and went to the front door, and he was commenting to his wife about the approaching storm as he went. At one point, he walked out onto the street and he had a conversation with a passing neighbour named Harry Burgess, who later recalled this meeting happening just after 10 p.m. When Harry Burgess left William Gardiner, he walked down the street and noticed a light in a top bedroom window at Providence House. Rose's employers, Mr. and Mrs. Crisp, retired to bed at around 10:15 p.m, just before the storm began. Mrs. Crisp woke up twice in the night. The first time was just after the storm began. She'd looked out of the window to see if it was raining. She then went downstairs into the dining room, closing the door between that room and the kitchen. Then she went back to bed. The second time she awoke was to a loud thud and scream, which came from within the house. Mrs. Crisp roused her husband and was about to get up, but Mr. Crisp told her go back to sleep. He said it was probably Rose startled by the thunderstorm. He reminded Mrs. Crisp that Rose had been told often enough that she could go to their room any time she felt nervous or was afraid. Around 8 a.m. the following morning, William Harsent, who was Rose's dad, called on Rose to return her washing, which her mother did for her every week, and Mr. Harsent then returned it every Sunday morning. Mr. Harsant entered the kitchen via a conservatory. He noticed that a woolen shawl had been fastened by a fork against the conservatory window. Inside the kitchen, he found Rose lying dead on the floor. Her throat had been cut end to end, cutting her windpipe clean in half. And there had been an attempt to burn her body. Rose was on her back. She was wearing a nightdress and stockings, and her hair was loosely done up. Her head was close to the stairs which led to her bedroom, and her feet were pointing toward the door which linked the kitchen to the conservatory. Underneath her head was a copy of the East Anglian Daily Times, which wasn't a paper that Mr. and Mrs. Crisp had. Part of the paper was burnt, but Rose's hair wasn't. Part of her lower nightdress was charred, but not her chest or throat. She also had 2 other stab wounds in her upper chest area, and her hands had wounds which indicated fighting off an attacker. The doctor and the police arrived around 20 to 9 in the morning to find her lying in a massive pool of blood. Just a minute. Massive pool of blood. Part of the paraffin lamp had been on the floor close to her body, but Mr. Harsant had moved it so he could cover his daughter with a rug. The rest of the lamp was scattered around the floor a little further from Rose's body. A candlestick which held a burnt-out candle stood about a foot from Rose's head, and there was broken pieces of a medicine bottle found about a foot away. The cork was still firmly fixed in the bottle. The doctor took the label off the medicine bottle and put it in his pocket. The constable searched Rose's bedroom. The bed hadn't been slept in. The constable found some interesting letters which would be used in court. One letter read, and this is the last letter that she'd received: Dear R, I will try to see you tonight at 12 o'clock at your place. If you put a light in your window about 10 o'clock for about 10 minutes, then you can take it out again. Don't have a light in your room at 12, as I will come to the back. And this letter was unsigned. They then found another 2 letters to Rose, which were signed by William Gardiner. They'd been written during May the previous year. They were friendly in tone, but no more than that. They were in reference to a scandal going around the village that linked William and Rose together in the early summer of 1901. There was also a bundle of letters that contained immoral matters. These were not signed. Furthermore, when the post-mortem was carried out on Rose, it revealed that she was 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. So we'll go back to the summer of 1901 to see what started it. The gossip which linked William Gardiner and Rose Harsant began on the evening of May the 1st, 1901, the year before a murder. It was that evening that a lad named George Wright saw Rose going into a Congregationalist chapel known as the Doctor's Chapel. It was part of Rose's duties to clean the chapel once a fortnight, as her employer, Mr. Crisp, owned part of the chapel. Rose herself was a member of the choir at the same primitive Methodist chapel as William Gardiner. According to George Wright, he saw William follow down the same path as Rose shortly after she'd entered the chapel. He didn't hang around to see what they were doing. He was hurried to find his mate, Alphonso Skinner, who also worked at the drill works. Both of them were young lads who appeared to have nothing better to do but revel in a bit of scandal. They told everyone that they heard William and Rose laughing inside the chapel, and a woman's voice cried out, "Oh, oh." At this point, Alphonso Skinner left, leaving George Wright alone. George, who now had no witness, said he heard a woman say, "Did you notice me reading my Bible last Sunday?" To which the man replied, "What were you reading?" She said, "I was reading about like what we have been doing tonight. I'll tell you where it is. 38th chapter of Genesis." George Wright said he saw Rose leave the chapel and William followed shortly after. George Wright and Alphonso Skinner spread the story like wildfire around the village. No one knows if what they say they heard was true, partly true, or completely false, especially as the story made them the centre of attention. Rose and William always denied the story, but it didn't help the reputation of William, who was a married man with 6 children, a foreman at the local works and a leading member of his chapel. William and Rose said that all William had done was respond to her request for help in closing the chapel door as it had stuck. Apparently, he was walking by, she'd seen him at the gate. She couldn't shut the door and she'd shouted him to give her a hand to close the door. When William got to hear of the gossip, he called the 2 lads to his office and demanded an apology and to withdraw what they said, but both lads refused to do so. William then wrote to Rose to tell her about it. "Dear Rose, I was very much surprised this morning to hear that there's some scandal going round about you and me going into the doctor's chapel for immoral purposes, so that I shall put it into other hands at once, as I have found out who it was that started it. Wright and Skinner say they saw us there, but I shall summons them for defamation of character unless they withdraw what they have said and give me a written apology. I shall see Bob tonight and we will come and see you together if possible. I shall at the same time see your father and tell him." Signed, William Gardiner. The Primitive Methodists decided to hold an inquiry. Wright and Skinner attended, but Rose didn't go. We don't know why she didn't go. Maybe if there was nothing going on, she just thought it nonsense and didn't see the need to go. But she was interviewed a few days later and she denied that there was anything going on. The outcome was a deadlock. William Gardiner resigned from all offices he held at the chapel, but a month later they reinstated him. This demonstrated that they thought he was telling the truth. On the day of the inquiry, William Gardiner wrote to Rose again. So, judging by the letter, this must have been just before the inquiry. Dear Rose, I have broke the news to Mrs. Gardiner this morning. She is awfully upset, but she says she knows it is wrong, for I was at home from 9:30, so I could not possibly be with you an hour, so she won't believe anything about it. I have asked Mr. Burgess to ask those 2 chaps to come to chapel tonight and have it out there. However, they stand by such a tale, I don't know, but I don't think God will forsake me now, and if we put our trust in him, it will end right. But it's awfully hard work to have to face people when they are all suspicious of you. But by God's help, whether they believe me or not, I shall try and live it down and prove by my future conduct that it's all false. Only wish I could take it to court, but I don't see a shadow of a chance to get the case, as I don't think you would be strong enough to face a trial. Trusting that God will direct us and make the way clear. I remain yours in trouble, W. Gardiner. So that's what started everything in the summer of 1901. We'll now go back to 1902. The police first thought that Rose had killed herself. No one knows where they got that idea from. It is possible that the doctor had influenced the idea, because at the inquest he'd said that he wouldn't commit himself when asked if the wounds on Rose's neck could have been self-inflicted, but he did say the fleshy part of the wound could have been made by glass. 2 weeks later, though, he changed his mind and said that he'd come to the conclusion that the wounds were not self-inflicted and that glass was not responsible for her injuries. William Gardiner was not immediately contacted, despite finding the 2 letters from him in a room, and the constable knew of the rumours that had been going around and he'd known of the chapel inquiry. They allowed the suicide theory to influence the investigation. William Gardiner wasn't spoken to until the Monday and at his works, not at home. This gave William Gardiner time to destroy any evidence if he was the murderer. He was arrested on the Tuesday evening, but that had given him 3 days to cover his tracks. Mrs. Gardiner was interviewed twice in the same day in regards to her husband's whereabouts. They never took notes because at this point they were thinking it was a suicide. There was no search of the house, nor were his clothes taken away for examination. The inspector returned to Mrs. Gardiner for a third visit when the doctor had remembered about the medicine bottle label. The inspector asked Mrs. Gardiner for the bottle, but obviously Mrs. Gardiner couldn't find it. And she said that she'd given Rose Harsant some camphorated oil. She said she may have put it in that bottle, but she didn't know whether Rose had taken it away. When William Gardiner was arrested on the Tuesday night, only then did they take his clothes for examination. In the trouser pocket, they found a 2-bladed pocket knife. This was sent to be analysed. When they read William the warrant for his arrest, he replied, "I am not guilty." Rose's inquest began on Tuesday the 3rd of June, the same day that William Gardiner was arrested. The man who signed the warrant was Captain E.B. Levitt Scrivener, and he was also the foreman of the coroner's jury. Later in the month, however, for unknown reasons, he asked if he could be excused from jury service, but the coroner refused. Mr. and Mrs. Harsent gave evidence. It seemed in 1900 Rose had become engaged to be married. They had also questioned Rose a few weeks before her death as to whether she was pregnant, but she denied it. Because police inquiries were still taking place, the case was adjourned to June the 16th, but again they could give no verdict as they said certain evidence would influence the committal proceedings at the Magistrates' Court, which was to be on June the 20th. This took place and they had to decide if the case was strong enough to send Gardiner to trial at the assizes. At the start, a solicitor declared that for the past year the prisoner and Rose Harsant had been having an immoral affair, but the defence objected to this, saying no such statement should be made unless there was proof. The opposition then said that they had witnesses, Wright and Skinner, which were the same allegations that were never proven as being no more than gossip before. There was no definite proof. The hearing was adjourned until July the 3rd. The inquiries continued. The Gardiner's next-door neighbours said they had seen Rose go to the Gardiner's back door around 9 p.m, but no one was home as Mr. Gardiner had gone to Kelsale and his wife had gone to the village shop, which was always open late on a Saturday night. An assistant gamekeeper testified that in the early hours of Sunday morning, he seen 2 sets of footprints going to and from the Gardiner's house to Providence House. He said they'd been made by Indian rubber soled shoes with bars across the treads. When asked, wouldn't the heavy rain have washed these prints away, he simply replied, "They weren't washed away because I saw them." The jury brought in a unanimous verdict for murder, naming William Gardiner. So on July the 3rd, 1902, the final sitting of the Magistrates' Court took place. The results of Gardiner's clothes came back. They were free of blood and paraffin. There was a very small piece of blood-stained cloth, which had been attached to a broken piece of glass, which was of a different sort of cloth from his clothes. There was also traces of blood on his pocket knife, but they couldn't ascertain how old the blood was. Never mind if it was human. There was too much doubt. Gardiner was committed for trial on November the 7th, 1902. According to the East Anglia Daily Times, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were allowed a few minutes together in the anteroom before he was returned to prison. Both were in tears. The first trial of William Gardiner took place in Ipswich between the 7th to the 10th of November 1902. Counsel for the prosecution was none other than Henry Fielding Dickens, Charles Dickens' son. During the trial, Henry Dickens stayed at the Great White Horse in Ipswich. This is the hotel mentioned by his father, Charles Dickens, in Pickwick Papers. 2 more fresh witnesses were called on who had not been found in time for the magistrate's trial. The jury then wanted to see the letters William had wrote to his wife from jail so they could compare the handwriting to those of the last letter that Rose had received. These were at his home in Peasenhall, so the courts dispatched someone to get them with the promise he wouldn't be prosecuted if he broke the speed limit. He did the 43-mile journey in 3 hours. The summing up of the judge was against William Gardiner and was strongly in favour of convicting him, but one juryman was against it, which he made quite clear by telling everyone that he'd heard nothing to convince him that the prisoner was guilty. William Gardiner was remanded in custody to wait for a fresh trial. By the end of the first trial, Mrs. Gardiner was left broke after paying for her husband's defence. She and her children were left to receive relief from the parish, and now she had to find money to pay for a second trial. What would she do? Well, she did what a lot of people today would do. She went to the papers. She wrote them a letter appealing for help. She wrote to the East Anglian Daily Times, and they printed her letter on November the 15th, 1902. I am the wife of William Gardiner, accused of the Peasenhall murder. I have 6 children. My husband has been in prison for more than 5 months, and during that time my children and I have received parish relief. What little money I get together went to pay for my husband's defence, and now I am penniless and heartbroken. I know that my husband is innocent, and I cannot allow him to go undefended if it can be avoided at his next trial. Would you help me and ask the public to help me also? P.S. The editor of the East Anglian Daily Times, Ipswich, has been so good as to promise to acknowledge contributions. It wasn't long until several hundreds of pounds poured in. The second trial got underway on Wednesday, January the 21st in 1903. The case for the Crown was again in the hands of Henry Fielding Dickens. By this point, the murder of Rose Harsant had spread throughout the country, and national newspapers from around the country were present. Wright and Skinner were summoned as witnesses. When asked if he had gone to the chapel expecting to hear something indecent, Wright very cockily replied, "We didn't expect to hear a sermon." It turned out that Wright knew Rose Harsant quite well. He often did odd jobs at Providence House and spoken to her when he was there, although he swore he'd never walked out with her. An admission was also had from Wright that some years before he had spread gossip about a young man and woman who he'd seen walk into an orchestra together. Wright testified that Gardiner had seen him quite plainly before he turned onto the path going to the doctor's chapel. But surely, if William and Rose were having a secret affair, he would not have continued into the chapel knowing he'd been seen by Wright, because secrecy is essential when you're having an affair. The second witness was John Gray, who was Superintendent Minister of the Methodist Circle. He was questioned about the inquiry they'd held and said that it did not absolve Gardiner, it had just said that no definite decision could be reached. He was also able to get the witness to testify that Gardiner had admitted to accompany Rose Harsant home from chapel on several occasions. Gardiner had declared to the witness he had been indiscreet and that in future he would be more careful. The cross-examiner shed a different light on the matter by implying, was it so unusual that a choirmaster and choir member should walk home together after chapel meetings, given that they only lived yards apart? Gardiner saying he would be more discreet in the future just meant that he wouldn't walk home with her again. Next was Henry Rouse, another Methodist minister. He stated that one night in February 1902 he had met William and Rose when he was on his way home. He said good night to them, but they never answered. He said he spoke to Gardiner about this 9 days later, and William promised it wouldn't happen again if Rouse never mentioned it to anybody. However, doubt was cast on Rouse's character, as another time, can't read my own writing, he'd said at a Sunday service Gardiner had put his feet into Rose's lap during the sermon. At the time, he never mentioned this, but afterward got his wife to write anonymously to Gardiner about his behaviour, but she made no mention of the putting of Gardiner's feet into Rose's lap. Rouse, at the first trial, had never mentioned it either. It's likely he made it up. Rouse also admitted that 9 or so congregation members could have seen Gardiner put his feet into Rose's lap, yet no one came forward with any knowledge of seeing this. It was then shown that Rouse was a troublemaker after being questioned about 3 incidents in his past life which showed he thrived on mischief. Harry Harsent, Rose's 14-year-old brother, was the next witness to be called to prove that William and Rose had been sending letters to each other. In 1901, he said he'd taken 2 or 3 letters to his sister and 1 or 2 from Rose to William. And he said in 1902 he'd taken 2 from William to Rose. But under cross-examination, he admitted that at the first trial, he had sworn that he'd taken no letters in 1902. Had somebody between the two trials tried to influence Harry? Mrs. Georgina Crisp was called by the prosecution so they could establish a time of death. However, Mr. Dickens didn't question her on the time. No one knows why. It ended up to the defence counsel to show that the witness didn't know the time, as she had been told the time by her husband, who thought it to be between 1 and 2 o'clock, but neither of them had looked at the clock. They should have called Mr. Crisp to testify, as he was in court, and at one point he even asked to speak, but he was told to sit down and shut up. This enabled the defence to instill doubt into the jury, because if they had no time of death, they couldn't prove Gardiner was at Providence House at the time of death. The doctor couldn't say how long she'd been dead, as rigor mortis could set in at various times throughout the British seasons. Experiments were carried out at the chapel as to whether a couple could be heard talking from the outside. They couldn't. There was also evidence that the door had been planed the previous year, proving that there had been trouble with the door. Mrs. Gardiner told the police that she was a great believer in camphorated oil for colds. She'd given Rose Harsant a bottle with the oil in it when she'd had a cold at Easter in 1902. The label on the bottle read, 2 or 3 teaspoons, a 6th part to be taken every 4 hours, Mrs. Gardiner's children. When the police returned to get shoes from Mrs. Gardiner, William indeed did have a pair of india rubber shoes, but Mrs. Gardiner said her husband had been given them by her brother, but Mr. Gardiner had never worn them. Mrs. Gardiner's statement concerning the night of the storm was as follows. My husband left home at about 2:30, returned home at 9:30, had his supper, went with me to Mr. and Mrs. Dickinson's and stayed there until 1:30. Then we went home to bed, and we did not leave our home until 8:30 the next morning. Later, she slightly changed the story by saying she went to the Dickinsons first and William followed shortly after. Mrs. Dickinson said that Mrs. Gardiner had gone to her house between 11 to 11:30 p.m. and Mr. Gardiner had followed between 11:45 to midnight. Mr. Gardiner didn't think that there was that much time in between, as he'd only gone upstairs to check on the children before he'd left. Mrs. Gardiner then said he'd followed her a couple of minutes later. Whatever the time difference, both the Dickinsons and Gardiner's statements place William Gardiner with them, not at Providence House at midnight, the time in which he allegedly arranged to meet her. Mrs. Gardiner was awake until 5 a.m. as she was in pain and couldn't sleep, so she knew William hadn't left their bedroom all night. Another witness, who was only interviewed after the police heard his story from a third party, said he'd seen a large fire coming from the wash house in the gardener's backyard, with smoke coming out of the chimney. This was around 7:30 a.m. on the morning of Sunday the 1st of June. He said he'd seen fires there before, but never that early. The prosecution was trying to make the point that William Gardiner was perhaps trying to burn clothing. Mr. Gardiner insisted that this story was a deliberate lie, as he lit his fire every Sunday morning shortly after 8 a.m, never any earlier. Frederick James Davis, who was then called by the Crown, as he had been discovered to be the writer of the bundle of the immoral letters that were found in Rose's bedroom. Although he wasn't prosecuted for anything, Mr. Dickens did make him do penance by publicly declaring how ashamed he was for writing such letters. Davis said this was how sexual knowledge was obtained by young adults, as society had failed to provide such education in the home, church or school. He said although him and Rose were very friendly, they'd never had an intimate relationship. Rose had wanted him to write down the bawdy lyrics that the village lads were going about saying. If she hadn't liked these letters, she'd have demanded he'd stopped writing them and she'd have destroyed them, not kept them in a bedroom. Davis had gone to bed around 10:30 p.m. the night of the storm. He shared a room with his brother, and to get downstairs he would have had to pass through his parents' bedroom. Davis also admitted that he'd given Rose a medical book which contained information on how to obtain an abortion, but it had other medical things in it as well, like how to cure chilled brains and sweaty feet. Davis also admitted giving Rose a pamphlet entitled Proper Discipline to be observed by married couples. In other words, birth control. Even the postman gave a statement saying the last letter to Rose had been posted at Peasenhall between 6:30 on the Friday night and 10:55 the next morning, Saturday, May the 31st, 1902. He delivered to He delivered it to Providence House just after 3 o'clock that Saturday afternoon, so it would appear that the writer of the letter lived in or very close to Peasenhall, or someone had managed to get the letter posted there so that it would look like he lived in Peasenhall. Whoever murdered Rose Harsant would have had a considerable amount of blood on their clothing, as the cuts inflicted on Rose would have spurted and flowed out. None of William Gardiner's clothes had blood stains. Mrs. Gardiner says she and Rose were friends, and Rose visited her frequently, even after the scandal had spread. She'd seen nothing between them to cause her to be suspicious. Mrs. Gardiner had only heard of Rose's death later in the morning, when a young man told her that Rose Harsant had committed suicide. Mrs. Gardiner was shown the last letter to Rose, and she told the police officer that it was not her husband's handwriting. Mrs. Gardiner became uncontrollably hysterical in the witness box and had to be revived from fainting fits. She was no longer able to testify. Was this because she was feeling the pressure to get her and William's story right? Or was it beginning to sink in that her husband was likely to hang, leaving her a penniless widow, bringing up 6 children? Or maybe he was covering for her, and one wrong word would have meant her swinging from the gallows. The local midwife confirmed that Rose had suffered a bad cold and had been given camphorated oil by Mrs. Gardiner, which confirmed the defence's story that the broken bottle containing paraffin was indeed the one Mrs. Gardiner had given her. The midwife also confirmed that Mr. Gardiner had not laid his legs in Rose's lap in chapel because her daughter was a member of the choir, and if Mr. Gardiner had done that, she'd have seen the incident along with most of the folk in chapel, and nobody'd seen anything. Another witness said he'd not seen any footprints. He himself wore hobnail boots and was walking that way at 4 a.m. It was raining heavy, and his own footprints were washing away as he walked. The courts never called any of the Gardiner's neighbours to testify whether they'd smelled smoke coming from the Gardiner's wash house that Sunday morning. Then nobody in the village had mentioned it either. Wright and Skinner's evidence would have been crucial, but it was dismissed. There were so many witnesses that could have been called, but the courts failed to do so. There appeared to be a lot of inefficiency in the gathering of evidence against Gardiner. Mr. Dickens set 10 points to be complied with for the murder to be identified. There was a plausible explanation for each of these points. On Saturday, the 24th of January 1903 at 5 p.m, the jury retired to decide its verdict. They re-entered the courtroom at 7:12 p.m. The foreman said they could not reach a verdict and it was unlikely they would, so the jury was discharged and William Gardiner went back to jail to await another trial. However, 5 days later, the Director of Public Prosecutions sent a telegram to William Gardiner's solicitor telling him to release Gardiner. There wasn't going to be another trial. At the first trial, the jury had voted 11-1 against conviction. At the second trial, the jury voted in reverse, 1 for conviction and 11 against. In a village of 700 people, only 3 said that they had seen William Gardiner and Rose Harsant in questionable circumstances, and 2 of these were Wright and Skinner, which were the same incident. Surely, in such a small village, a married man and a single lady could not have carried on an affair for over a year without more people having witnessed something. Especially after Wright and Skinner started gossiping, people would have been watching them to catch them out having an affair. Who could have murdered Rose Harsant? Maybe her employer, William Crisp. Rose was never seen going out with the man. He had every opportunity of getting intimate with her inside Providence House. And why wouldn't he allow his wife to get up and investigate that second time when he heard her scream? After all, he hadn't said nothing when she got up the first time. Why was he never called to give witness either? He would have had no need to have written that fateful letter, as Rose was already in his home that night, so I don't think it could have been him. What about the man Rose had been engaged to marry in 1900? We don't know who he was or even why they broke up. Suppose he'd held a grudge and wanted revenge when he heard the rumours. Maybe he felt jealous and believed the rumours. There is written in the trial of William Gardiner a note which says there was a young man named Alderman Jenkins of Southwold who was a photographer employed by the police to take the photographs. In 1952, he told the lady who owned the booklet that from evidence in the kitchen there was no doubt that a man had been there and that Rose and the man had made love. But this wasn't mentioned at the trial. Also, what about Frederick Davis next door, the one who gave her the immoral letters? Although he said it was impossible to leave his room without being detected, supposing his parents were sleeping heavy, maybe he often snuck out when they were fast asleep. After all, he was a young lad, and how many did that? Davis could have even got out of his bedroom via the window, then went through the fence into the backyard at Providence House. There is a police register in existence from 1902 which states that Davis, along with another youth, had appeared a few months earlier in a magistrate's court charged with assault on a girl, and that case was dismissed. Others considered the doctor. They didn't have to be seen together, as it could be done within the surgery, and he did act out of order by putting the medicine label in his pocket for safekeeping when he should have handed it to the policeman in charge at the time. When he had to hand it over at a later date, was it even the same label he handed over? William Gardiner fell to his knees and thanked God for his deliverance when he heard the news of his release. Soon after, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, along with their children, moved away from Peasenhall. In the 1911 census, his address is given as 63 Hartington Road, Southall. He and his wife had gone on to have 2 more daughters. William Gardiner died in 1941, aged 74, being one of the few people in English history to have been tried for murder and to have never received a verdict. He was neither innocent or guilty. He was never formally acquitted. For the rest of his life, he lived under a cloud of suspicion. Julian Fellowes investigates came to the conclusion it was Mrs. Gardiner who murdered Rose in a fit of jealousy. He thought that if her husband had been convicted, she would have confessed. Then he also implicated a man named Albert Goodchild, who he said was a maltster from Burton-on-Trent, a stranger around Peasenhall and a bit of a strange man. Well, I know that that's not true, because Albert Goodchild, he definitely wasn't a stranger around Peasenhall, and he wasn't born and brought up in Burton-on-Trent. He was actually from Baddingham in Suffolk, which is the next village along from Peasenhall, one of the next villages. He was good friends with Rose's older brother, John Harsent, who was never even mentioned in any of the trials. And they'd moved away together to go and pursue work in the breweries in Burton-on-Trent, which was Bass's Breweries in Burton-on-Trent. And under the 1901 census, you can see quite clearly both of them were boarding there. And my 3 times great-grandfather, he is the first one from Suffolk to have come up to Staffordshire, and he wrote back regular because not all of his children moved up with him, because some were older and married and they were still having children, as he had big families in those days. But he wrote regular back to family back in around Dennington, Peasenhall, and all those areas, saying that there was plenty of work. So they were obviously struggling for work in those parts down in Suffolk. But he was saying there was plenty of work up here and for them to come up. Well, John Harsant, Rose's brother, he was, I think, a year older than Rose. He decided that he would come up, and he brought Albert Goodchild with him because they were friends. So they were up here then. Whether at the time of the death they were back in 1902 in Peasenhall, I don't know, but definitely in 1901 they were up in the breweries up here. So Rose would have known Albert. I mean, who knows? He might have been the one that she'd been engaged to, and that's one of the reasons him and John went. He went with John to the breweries, moved up to Burton-on-Trent, perhaps to get away from seeing Rose, because perhaps he was heartbroken. After all, he did marry later on, but it was another 10 years until he got married. And he did turn out quite a fine figure of a man, actually. So I don't think at all it was Albert Goodchild, not at all. I do think he may have been the one that she'd been engaged to, but I definitely don't think he was the murderer. So, yeah, that was the story of Rose. To this day, nobody knows who murdered him. Most people seem to think it was William Gardiner, but then there are others that say it was his wife, Mrs. Gardiner. Myself, well, I know, like I said, I've spoken to a distant cousin and we talked about this, and she has spoken to Gardiner's ancestors, and it was under the belief that it was Mrs. Gardiner that actually committed the murder, and that she had actually even worn his shoes that the brother had given her. So, because it had been clearly obvious if a women's prints had been picked up. But this is what they're saying, but nobody knows for sure. There's been no letters left, nothing saying that it was her. This is just speculation between the two families, our families and their families, just speculate. But myself, I'm still a bit, I have got a suspicion it could have been Davis from next door, the Davis lad from next door. If he didn't commit the murder, I wouldn't be surprised if he wasn't the father of the child, because I'm going on the fact that he sent her all these immoral letters. It was like, he described it as like a way of sex education because they didn't receive it anywhere. This is how the youngsters of the day learnt about things. So, and he'd also said in another statement that they talked about these things as well and seen pictures of these things. So if they were two young couples, young boy, young girl, together in the prime of their lives and talking about such things, it's highly likely that these things would have gone on between them. Highly likely. And there's every good chance that that child may have been Davis's. But as to whether Davis murdered her, I don't know. What reason would he have had really? Because both of them were in a position that if it was his child, they could have gone on to get married, unless of course he didn't want to, he didn't want nothing to do with it. Who knows? But I'm open-minded on Mrs. Gardiner. I do not think it was William Gardiner. I don't think it was William Gardiner. I am open-minded on Mrs. Gardiner, and I very much would say, if out of any of them, that Davis had more to do with it than what he said. So what do you think? Go away. You can have a look on other YouTube channels. There's stories on it. But what they do is give light on, you know, like a jury. It's made me realise how things can be easily influenced to the jury and how somebody innocent could end up being found guilty because you can be so easily swayed by somebody telling you something. And there's different accounts of it on YouTube, and also Julian Fellows, the one who did Downtown Abbey, he did an investigation onto it. But I mean, other than like he thought it was Mrs. Gardiner, the rest of his story doesn't really figure. So yes, go away, have a look. There is books on it as well. I've taken some of the extracts from the book on here. But yes, it's still open. I wish I'd opened the case again, really, and we could look more into it. All of the evidence and everything that they had still exists. All of the police records still exist. People can still go and see it and study it and see what they decide. I would love it to be reopened to see. Obviously, these people are all dead now and there's no way you can bring anybody to justice. But it certainly would be nice to know. So that's it. That's the family tree business for this week. I told you it'd be a long one. Definitely drop me comments down below if you've got questions or anything about it. I'll do my best to find out, or I might already know answers other than who actually did it. If there's a lot of questions or comments about it, maybe I'll do another video about it again. So that's it for this week. So like I say, there's a lot of psychology involved there, and it's quite good for educational purposes. But I should be hopefully back with you next Tuesday now, and we'll do something totally different next Tuesday. So until then, everybody take care, and I'll see you next week. Bye.